Hello and welcome back to another YouTube video. Today I'm doing 25.18 mid lane tier list. So enjoy content, like, subscribe, and let's get into it. There were a lot of changes towards mid lane this patch. We are coming up to Worlds, and I want to shift the meta around. So we've nerfed out some of the top of the table mid laners, some of the highest prior ones, and they've also just pushed some other ones which I think can make the jump into competitive. Your Cassiopeias and your Hueys, for example, are like fringe meta picks at the moment, but not quite there, and Riot feel comfortable buffing them to kind of allow them to find their space within the current pro meta. Let's get into it. So the D tier is going to consist of 5 champions now. I'm dropping Azir down to the D tier. The nerf he received this patch was pretty sizable. It was the same, I believe it was on the same scope as the buff he received when I bumped him from the D to the C tier. The champ now goes back to being the kind of pick which I only really recommend if you're very comfortable on him. I don't recommend learning him anymore. That kind of space is over. The champion has been hit pretty heavily this patch and goes back to being just a not a particularly good solo queue option. I just wouldn't really recommend him unless you're like Master Plus or like GM Plus and you're kind of playing for like comp practice or just like trying to break that like comp barrier. The other picks within the D tier are still remaining champions. The Varuses, AP Varus just isn't in a good state at the moment. I don't really recommend it. The more standard builds, I believe like the Ginsus and the experimental Hexplate variants actually seem to have some level of success. I think Varus in general is just a bit below the bar at the moment, just across the board. But if you opt into like the correct builds, and there is some level of optimization to be done, I do think he gets slightly better in that space. Corki is probably the top out of the other 3 options. The other 2 are Tristana and Smolder. Smolder, surprisingly, maintains a pretty consistent player base in mid lane. He seems to have fallen into a pretty solid player base spot. In terms of performance, he's under the bar. Sort of mid just doesn't perform that well. I think in some counter pick scenarios you can definitely get more value out of the champion, but he's the kind of pick which if you don't play, I don't really recommend him, and if you do play, you'll probably continue to play him because you enjoy the archetype of the champion, but he doesn't perform that well in the mid lane. In the case of Tristana, she got nerfed a while ago, same kind of package with Corki, but both these champions lost a decent chunk of their early game power or pushing power to kind of push them away from mid lane. They also kind of nerfed their level scaling in that space as well to just make them less viable mid lane picks. This was back when AP or tank jungles were kind of popping up into the meta quite frequently, and you needed AD mid laners to facilitate them. Tristana and Corki were pretty dominant in that space, and yeah, they've definitely been nerfed since then. Moving on to the C tier then, we need off for Kog'Maw. AP Kog'Maw just seems to be a bit mediocre. It doesn't really seem to have found success. It's frustrating to play against. Its range combined with its relative simplicity does give it that kind of does allow it to just exist within that space. It doesn't put out particularly good numbers though. I do think there's still some level of refinement, and it's a relatively fresh pick to come into the mid lane. It wasn't that popular beforehand, and with a bunch of new players you're definitely going to see a pretty sizable win rate dip. As people refine it, I might bump it up to the B tier. I'm not in a hurry to though. I do think there are just better artillery mages at the moment, which I would recommend learning over him. But if you enjoy the champion, then yeah, he's there as an option for you. Viego really didn't hit the ground quite as running quite as well as I hoped he would or perceived he would. I actually thought Viego mid would be pretty decent because even before these buffs, it looked like it was in a pretty solid spot. And the sustain went from 50% to 100%. I thought for sure this would definitely enable him to be a bit better. He's just not putting out good enough numbers at the moment. I do think that the build seems to still tread towards damage variants rather than bruiser variants. Bruiser variants still look to be slightly below the bar, albeit more consistent. Yeah, he's just not there at the moment. I think if you want an AD pick though and you enjoy him, then it's perfectly reasonable to opt into him, but he's definitely, sitting towards the lower end of the C tier at the moment. Yone is in a bit of a weaker spot at the moment. He's actually one of the, he's probably the only AD competitively balanced champion in the mid lane at the moment. Jace is obviously flexed between the two, and without the buffs, it's hard to say kind of where he's, with the buffs, it's hard to say where he's going to land going into Worlds. I do think he's going to be very high prio though, 20 damage on Q level 1 is very meaningful for a champion like Jace, and will enable him to get prio more consistently, which is big for both mid and top. And it would be nice. I think having multiple mid laners, AD mid laner options rather than just Yone as the tier 1 kind of AD mid laner is pretty nice, so yeah, that's good to see. That being said, though, I am leaving Jason in the C tier. For solo queue, he's still a hard champion to pilot, and I still just don't really recommend him below Master. And for like Gold to Master, which is like what this tier list is kind of focused at, he's just, yeah, he's under the bar at the moment for like average play. I mean, that makes sense. Like, Jace is a champion, which I think if he's good in average play, he's probably just overpowered in competitive. So yeah, he's just going to be left in the state. But if you want to play him, yeah, it's perfectly reasonable too. It's primarily just like the damage builds at the moment, like Yomu's. We don't really see the like bruiser variants that much. We still see them sometimes in competitive, like Shojin Grasp variants. But yeah, like you're defaulting on Yomu's normally. Gangplank sits within the C tier. He's just a very hard pilot to champion to pilot. I actually played against Solobaka I actually played against him on the 13th, so that would be 3 days ago now. Time flies. And that was quite amusing. Like, he plays the champion like nobody else, and I think I like said that when I was like playing against him. Anyway, that was kind of funny. And yeah, I mean, it's very clear that Gangplank, if you pilot it really well, can be really potent as a champion. But even then, like, I still think he's a bit below the bar at the moment, and I leave him in like the C tier at the moment. Like, I don't really recommend Gangplank unless you put a lot of mastery into him. Mel and Rise wrap up the remaining C tier options. In the case of Mel, she just skill maxes wrong, like you should Q max over E max, and that would bump her up a placement. I'm interested to see what long term they do with Mel. Like, she seems to be in this really weird state where she still maintains a decent player base in like mid, support, and even bot lane, and like I'm pretty sure most people perceive her as being a very good bot lane champ at least. Whether they end up doing something to the kit to kind of unskew her like skill max order, I will be interested to see. Right now that's not happening though, so I do have her in the C tier, but if you max E, I do think she can like compete with DB and A tier like placements. I don't think she's like that far off in her current state. Rise, I have him in the C tier. He could honestly be bumped back up to the B tier. Like, I don't think he's like a locked C tier option, but the B tier is very full at the moment, and I do think some of the champions I would just recommend less, and Rise is just like one of those more competitively balanced champions which performs better in Master than like below Master, so I have him in the C tier at the moment. And for that, Talia, I'm also bumping down. She like lost a decent chunk of power this patch. I believe it was mana for damage, if I remember correctly. Oh yeah, so yeah, she lost damage, but she gained lower mana costs, so she's not like so bound to those like double like dual mana builds, like I believe it was like Roa Seraphs we saw a lot of, which is nice. I think that's quite good. And Talia jungle definitely benefited because they also buffed up her jungle slightly, but Talia mid definitely lost power. I do think she is probably going to drop out of competitive mostly. She will still see competitive play, I don't doubt that, but is not going to be like one of the highest pro mid laners anymore. For average play though, yeah, she sits as more like a C tier option. I just don't really recommend her anymore. Honestly, Ari, I'm like kind of tempted to drop down to C tier, but I'm going to leave her at the bottom of the B tier. She's definitely substantially weaker than a lot of the kind of other champions in the like B, A, S tier kind of region. Like, she's definitely suffered over time with either direct nerfs or just like nerfs to her build. Like the Roa Leandries, which she was really taking off with a while ago, has practically faded away at this point. We're looking at mostly Malignance variations, and yeah, she's just sat towards the low end of the B tier. I just don't recommend her as much as some of the other options, and there are a plethora of other options over her at the moment. Aurora also sits towards the low end of the B tier. She just performs worse below the Master Bar than above the Master Bar. That is just the case with some of these like B tier options, that the higher up you go, they will perform better. They are just more elite skewed champions, and if you're willing to sink the time into them, then you can definitely claw back some of that, but you're gonna be looking at more than like 50 games to really unlock their full potential in a lot of situations. Twisted Fate, I don't like him that much, and he's become a kind of this running meme of a champion. Like, he really doesn't perform that well in competitive either, which is quite funny to see. Obviously the MSI joke is always going to be the one which comes to mind for the fact that he won like no games, I'm pretty sure. It's like crazy to think about, or maybe he won one, I can't specifically remember. But yeah, this pick is it has its merits. Like, I'm gonna leave it in the low end of the B tier. Like, I think there is some value to Twisted Fate, but I just don't recommend him at the moment, so I'm gonna leave him towards the lower end. Like, I think there are better options than him. Brand, this is the Elo bracket he does best in, but even then, he's not an amazing mid laner. Like, he's fine, and if you're looking for a AoE, damage over time, high DPS, like Matron, I think he can fit the bill. Lissandra, I have in the beta. She can maybe be dropped down to the C tier. I'm honestly hoping she gets buffed this patch. I think it'd be quite nice to maybe see some Lissandra creep back into Worlds. Not as like one of the main picks in mid lane, but just some. I think she can be quite an interesting champion in like small quantities, but definitely on the weaker side at the moment, so I do have him in the B tier. AP Twitch is pretty solid. I have him in the B tier. He probably sits more like a mid to high end B tier option. Like the rest of these, I'd say a low B tier. Twitch is more like a mid to high end. And the build can be really strong in the right spots. He's pretty unique in the way he plays. And if you enjoy the playstyle, I actually think he's a legitimate option at the moment. Malphite is obviously a bit interesting of a mid lane option. You either go the AP or the tank variant, or you can go tank and splash some AP. We have seen Malignant's tank variants of this champion. Overall, he's easy to play, and you can usually find good compositions to play him into. You can't ever blind him though, and that is a big markdown. Like if you can only really play him as like an R5 fear of being counterpicked by like a Silas, then yeah, the champion definitely loses a lot of its recommendation value. Gragas, I have him in the B tier. He's a solid mid lane option, mostly played by OTPs, but if you're comfortable on him, he can definitely do a lot within the game. Kiana, I'm moving her towards the low end of the B tier. She lost a certain amount of power. She is also one of the most, if not just outright, the most elite skewed champion in the game at the moment. And yeah, that's a pretty heavy markdown. But she still performs well in average play. Not that well. Maybe actually C tier is probably correct for her, but she's definitely on a high at the moment. So I'm gonna leave her towards the low end of the B tier and probably reevaluate going into next patch. The other assassins are still here. Your Talons, your LeBlancs, your Zeds. I think if you've put time into these champions, they can be valuable. If you haven't put time into them, I don't recommend playing assassins in the current state of the game. Unless you're unless you like the archetype, basically. It's just not worth it. I think there are just better options which can be more generic, I guess you could say. If you play Orianna and you play Syndra, you're usually doing pretty well. As if you play an assassin, like you play your LeBlanc, then it can definitely be a bit harder to shift around towards some of the other options. And they are time investments. You do need to sink a decent chunk of time into these champions to get value out of them. And action, I usually put alongside them for the most part. Cho'Gath, not doing as well in mid lane. He's been a bit he's definitely lost a lot of power with some of the shift arounds to his kit. Tank Cho'Gath is still really good in the top lane. If you want to play Cho'Gath anyway, I recommend top Cho'Gath. I really like him as a pick there. But yeah, mid lane Cho'Gath, the Shurelya build is just not that good in its current state. It took a sizable amount of nerfs through either Shurelya, through his kit, through Symbiotic Souls getting a slight tag down. There's just been a couple of things which have kind of affected him and left him in a bit weaker of a state. Radiant Soul, he takes a long time to come online, but he performs decently well in this bracket. If you don't get punished, then you can usually scale up, and he's really hard to close games out against. So another effort from this champion, because you can usually find a way to come back in and just take over the game. It's not a consistent win con. But yeah, I think that's probably the way I kind of put the champion at the moment. Orianna, just a bit below the bar for average play. She's still obviously very popular and competitive and high elo. She does pretty well there. But in average play, yeah, she's just a bit below the bar at the moment. Ziggs is a solid artillery option. I don't think he's one of the premier ones in mid lane, but we've seen him bleed into competitive a bit, and he does have matchups where he can be quite good. The one which is obviously common in competitive is the Azir matchup, which doesn't really matter as much in solo queue because no one's going to play Azir for the most part in this bracket. So it's whatever. This champion is just a B tier artillery option. And then I've got some options which I'm moving up. I have dropped some down. In fact, I've dropped 3 champions down. So I've dropped Silas back down. It's crazy. I feel like I moved this champion up and down every other patch. It's kind of just an ongoing thing at this point. It depends. It literally just depends on the patch. Sometimes I just feel like you can get away with playing this champion in more situations than maybe you're allowed to, but the nerfed jungle does lose some of his, I mean, it's still a flex pick, but, some of that flex potential, I guess, is definitely gone, and that is just, I mean, and, you're not going to be able to do objectives as quickly, and you can argue that's just enough to just drop him from the A tier down to the B tier, so I'm gonna just tag him down to the B tier. He's still a good option, though. If you want to use him as a counter pick, I think he's pretty solid at the moment. The other 2 champions I'm dropping down are Annie and Pantheon. Not Pantheon. Annie and Galio. So Galio took a pretty sizable hit this patch. Honestly surprising. Didn't think he would actually lose as much power as he did. It was a 5% AP ratio on the passive and 2% maximum health on the Q, which is probably where the main mover is, but he's definitely lost a decent chunk of power. He was a top of the, he was a low S tier option. I think he was good in, like, counterpick scenarios, but there are decent, like, amount of champions which can have a better time into him in the mid lane. But, yeah, he kind of just jumps the A tier and goes all the way down to the top of the B tier. Now I think he's just like if you're comfortable with the counter matchups, he's still like solid as an option, but no longer this like, oh, I just defaults into like almost all the AP matchups kind of champion. I just don't think he's as good as that anymore. And then, yeah, Annie lost power on her W, lost power on her baseline R magic penetration. She's a bit weaker of a champion. Most people in solo queue didn't max W, which is why they went after it, because, like, that's what most competitive players max on the champion. Her wave clear is bad. That is a pretty well-known fact at this point, and yeah, the tag to her W is definitely going to be meaningful and probably felt by the people who are still maxing W. Yeah, I'm just going to drop her to the top of the B tier. I still think she became good in the right states, and it's only, like, by your level, like, 11 mark, you're losing a bit of damage through the W and a pretty minor amount of damage through the pen on the R, so you can get some of that power back for the most part. The A tier then, so actually a couple of champions moving up. Number one is, which order are this in? So, okay. So the two champions which are probably towards the lower end of the A tier at the moment, which I'm moving up, are Kassadin and Vel'Koz. Kassadin is doing sizably better with his buffs, and I think he's a lot more recommendable as a champion in his current state. Vel'Koz received a buff, surprisingly. I don't think the champion was that weak. Like, he was a pretty the top of the B tier option, and now I think he's a pretty middle of the pack A tier option. I think the champ's in a pretty good state. He's still going to mostly play by those OTPs, or by the OTPs, which can like perform quite well on the champion. And yeah, I think he's a pretty solid A tier option now. The other champions which I'm moving up include the likes of Morgana, who I'm actually moving towards the top of the A tier. She's in a very good state for mid lane at the moment, and I wouldn't be surprised if they nerf her for 25.19, because there's genuine concern that she could become quite popular for Worlds. And I don't think Morgana is a particular interesting champion to watch if she's in a lot of games. The odd game of Morgana mid is fine, but I do think she probably should get a slight tag down so she doesn't become too overwhelming in, like at Worlds for the most part. And then the other champion moving up is Garen. Garen got buffed this patch. It actually when the power of the buff actually ended up being more than I expected. It was like 2% AD ratio on the E, which is a total AD ratio. And if you can more consistently get people down to your R threshold, that is going to be a lot of power. So yeah, I think he's a pretty top of the like A tier option now. Definitely a champion I would recommend as like to have if you're looking for an AD mid laner within your pool, which is a bit more accessible than like your Chases and your Yones, for example. So the A tier then, Sion, in a really good state at the moment, a great sort of stonewall, hard to kill champion in the mid lane. I think if you understand how to utilize his ultimate to kind of cheat tempo, and how you kind of want to play the fact that you can get pushed pretty consistently, or you just can't really be ganked that easily to affect your sides, I think he's in a very good state at the moment. Above the bar, very solid A tier pick. Aurelia, I have on the A tier. She's still got the little red note attached to her of don't play this pick unless you're an OTP. I think she requires so much time investment at the moment, and she's probably one of the most egregiously early game skewed champions in her current state. If you fall behind on this pick, you will be miserable. If the game goes to 25 minutes and you haven't kind of taken over, you will feel pretty miserable. She's kind of fallen into this state at the moment, which I don't really like. I think it feels quite bad to play against, and it probably maybe it doesn't feel bad to play. Like, I actually don't play Aurelia. Like, she's one of the top laners, which I just avoid because I'm not willing to sink the time into the pick. So I'll be interested to know, like, if you main Aurelia, like what your kind of perception of the champion is at the moment and what you think Riot should do with it. I'd actually be like genuinely interested in that regard. Vex is just an A tier counter pick option. I think she's in pretty good state at the moment. She counters a lot of the top, like the more popular mid laners, Yasuo's for example. She can definitely do quite well into, as she can like exploit the fact that he just wants to E through the wave and then just like rip passive stacks from him. Zoe sits within the A tier, low A tier option. She's definitely got a barrier to entry. She's a pretty elite skewed pick as well, but she's definitely in one of her better states at the moment, so I do have her remaining as an A tier option. Fizz, I think, as a counter pick, is a really good champion. They buffed him kind of recently, and that was meaningful. It did enough to kind of bring him back as an option. If you want to use him as a counter pick, then yeah, I have him as an A tier counter pick option. Anivia sits within the A tier. She's fine. She's definitely in one of our weaker states at the moment. That weak, obviously in quotation marks, she's still a good champion. Like, I still recommend her because I think her wave clear, her early game, her scaling, her control, all really, really like strong aspects of the pick. Plus, she's really hard to kill through the passive. Yeah, I think there's a lot of things to kind of recommend about Anivia, but she's definitely got a barrier to entry, and she's quite unique in the way she functions as a champion. And Neferi sits as like a lower A tier option, like AD option. I still think she's really good if you like are comfortable with the champion, but she requires like mastery at this point. Like, I don't think you can get away with just first time the champion. There are better AD options which I'd recommend over her in that regard. Nico sits within the A tier, obviously really unpopular these days, kind of in the mid lane especially, which is quite unfortunate. If you understand how to use the W, she's an incredible champion, and I think that is always going to be the main recommendation of this pick, is just make sure you learn how to like maximize the value of that spell, because it can do so many different things, and it's so game warping in like what it can do, like blocking skill shots, in providing vision, and like how you kind of like use that vision to find gank angles. I just think there's so many things which a champion can do, which like yeah, just require so much mastery to understand. And the fact that she's like a lane bully more than anything at the moment is yeah, just so much kind of elite skewedness to the champion. Albeit, I still think she's decent for like average MMR brackets. Hi Minninger, I have him in the A tier. I think he's a pretty solid niche option. I just have him next to Nico because they're both in a pretty niche spot at the moment. Reluctant is one of my other AD options. I think if you're comfortable with the champion and you want to play him into like Yasuo's and Yones, for example, can be pretty good. He definitely doesn't stomp them quite as well in the shorter lane, but he still does like decently, like, and you can oftentimes find that the health bar through the ultimate and the damage he can provide can be quite valuable within the game. Veigar, I'm kind of dropping him towards the lower end of the A tier at the moment. He's definitely not one of his greatest states, albeit this is the elo bracket he performs best in, so he's still like recommendable here, but I'm not as comfortable recommending him for like higher elo at the moment, or like as a climbing pick towards high elo, because I just don't think he's in that good of a state at the moment. Malzahar, I'm in the A tier. I think he's got one, like, he trivializes certain parts of the game, allowing you to think of other parts, which I think is a really valuable thing for a mid lane champion. And yeah, it's a really good selling point of the pick. He also has similar issues to Veigar, but he does just perform a lot worse the higher up you go. So I just don't really recommend him outside of like this elo bracket for the most part. Swain, I'm in the A tier. I think he's in a pretty good spot at the moment. He's obviously still really unpopular in the mid lane, but if you understand the compositions you want to play him into, I think he's a great champion to have within your arsenal. And that follows with a lot of these other options here. Lux, for example, I think is a really slept on mid laner. Her wave clear, her burst potential, her snowballing, all really powerful. Not quite as mainstream as like obviously a lot of the other options towards the high end of the A tier, but definitely like I think if you're very comfortable on it, can be quite a good pick. My mainstream options are still like your Xeraths. I still really like him as like one of the premier artillery options. I think Victor is still a great champion to learn the kind of like laning phase potential of this pick. Utilizing like the Q combined with like the range of the E can be really potent, combined with his mid game, which is like where he really spikes as a champion. I think a really core and strong aspects of the game to have like an understanding of, which is why I do still very much recommend him. Akali and Syndra, I also really recommend these champions. I think Akali is the most mainstream assassin for like competitive, and it allows you to kind of watch people play the champion outside of just OTPs. It also kind of gives you an understanding of what you want to play the champion into, like your Orianas and your immobile mages, which you can like get onto and make their life really hard. And Syndra has been in a good state for a while, ever since they made the changes to kind of push away from the CDR build, albeit I still think her CDR build performs quite well, if I remember correctly. Yeah, she still remains as like a top tier A tier mid laner. And then Yasuo still sits within the A tier. He's probably the number 2 AD option still. Actually, the number 3 AD option. I keep forgetting Quinn really benefited from playing Hydra buff, and she's definitely in a really good state at the moment. But yeah, he's the most popular out of like the AD mid laners, and it makes sense. Like if you can find a composition or a lane which you're really good into, he can usually be very powerful, and people really like playing the champion. Makes sense. He's very like fun to pilot. So the S tier, we have the addition of Hui. We buffed this patch, pushed him from the A tier and into the S tier. I'm surprised he got buffed, but the buff, to be honest, feels quite nice. I believe it was the WE, the slipstream. No, WQ. I don't remember which one it is. W is actually the 3 dots for the Nami passive. The WQ is the slipstream. The slipstream got buffed, which is really nice because that ability felt pretty limp. And yeah, now it feels like a real ability. It's quite nice to see. But the E-AP ratio buff going up by 5% might have been too much. I think he's definitely going to be one of the premier options at Worlds. At least like in like the best of series. Maybe not so much in like the single elims, albeit I don't know if they're doing single elims. Anyway, for Solo Q, yeah, he's in a really good state at the moment. Sits within the S tier. Kennen, Quinn, and honestly Pantheon and Kayle all fit as like niche kind of options. They're not quite as mainstream as the other picks I have up here, but Kayle is a incredible scaling option, and she's very hard to punish in mid lane. Pantheon is probably the best AD option because of his I'll have them next to each other. Pantheon and Quinn are very good AD options because of their ability to influence the map, which I think can be a really powerful tool to have as a mid laner, especially in the current meta where influencing the map as mid laner is a bit harder because of the way that like both mid laners just want to push waves against each other, and then you can oftentimes just mirror or deny the opponent. I think these two champions are really good cheat tools in that regard. Kennen is obviously very niche, like he's probably the nichest out of the 4 here, but his ability to kind of completely turn team fights, his lane bullying capability, combined with the fact that people just won't understand how to play against him, is incredibly valuable. And then my other 2 options, so these are all a bit more like common. Cassiopeia, the buff this patch was just ridiculous. I don't know what Riot were thinking. She was already seeing comp play as a counter pick option into like your Silas's and your Rises, for example. But the plus 12 damage on Twin Fangs combined with the plus 50 mana, it's just absurd. Like this is just like exactly what Cassiopeia wants, and they just gave it to her when she's already like fine. So yeah, Cassiopeia shoots back up as an S tier option. I think that was really like I mean, she could have maybe got a slight tap up. I think that could have been fine. Maybe a part of her kit which she didn't feel as rewarded using, but this was just absurd. And then yeah, the other AP assassins all remain here. Case in Diana Echo. Diana's an incredible laner, with like a very powerful kind of she just provides so much damage as a champion. I think she's slept on as a mid laner more than anything. And then Echo, I actually feel like I see a lot more Echo these days. Has insane kind of like damage as well. They are, like the AP assassins of the mid lane. They snowball really aggressively. They can like roam around the map. They're just good for solo queue. Like, I think there's just not many, like, markaways from these champions outside of just, like, really recommending them as, like, good options. In case of Vladimir, he's a bit more, like, you want to scale. You want to be able to, like, find the team fight angles later on into the game, but I think he's really hard to punish. He kind of follows the same vein of thought as Kayle, where the champion, to try and push him out of lane, requires so many resources, and oftentimes if your jungler is like either ganking the sides or just farming, then Vladimir will eventually reach the point where he can just take over the game, and I think that is a very powerful champion to have within your arsenal. Anyways, overall, those are my thoughts for the 25.18 middle lane tier list. So if you enjoy the content, I've done the wrong thing. I've done my intro. I haven't slapped yet. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.